was supposed to be a thrill, just an adrenaline rush to kick off Halloween night. The haunted house we picked was legendary in our town, known for its lifelike scares and intense realism. The locals loved to talk about it like it was some rite of passage, but those who had gone through it claimed it was more than just a haunted house. People whispered about strange things happening afterward, nightmares that never faded, and worse, the disappearances of those who never made it out. I figured it was all urban legend. I went with my girlfriend, Sarah, who was always the braver one, but even she seemed tense as we approached the entrance. The flickering lights and blood-curdling screams coming from inside only heightened the sense of impending doom. We exchanged nervous glances, both trying to play it cool. The line outside was short, which was odd for such a notorious attraction on Halloween night. I tried to brush it off, but something gnawed at me. The wind was unnaturally cold, and every gust felt like icy fingers crawling up my spine. Sarah squeezed my hand, her expression firm, as if she was psyching herself up. "You ready for this?" she asked, but there was an edge to her voice, one I hadn't heard before. I nodded, though my stomach churned. "Yeah, let's do it." As we crossed the threshold, it felt like stepping into another world. The door slammed behind us, the sound echoing through the darkness. Inside, it was a maze of shadows, broken only by disorienting strobe lights that flickered at erratic intervals. The walls seemed to close in on us, narrowing with every step. Grotesque actors, dressed in ragged costumes and painted with disturbingly lifelike makeup, jumped out from hidden corners. Some of their faces were twisted into expressions of pure agony, their eyes wide and desperate, as if they weren't acting at all. It was hard to believe it was all fake. I kept telling myself it had to be, though every scream, every cry of pain sent shivers down my spine. We laughed after each scare, forcing ourselves to treat it like a game, but something felt wrong. The further we went in, the more it seemed like the walls were shifting, tightening. Sarah and I kept getting turned around, and what started as fun quickly turned into confusion. The actors weren't just jumping out anymore. They were lingering, their eyes following us long after they should have retreated into the darkness. One of them, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, grabbed Sarah's arm as we passed, her bony fingers digging into Sarah's skin with surprising strength. "Help me," she whispered, her breath hot and foul. "He's coming." Sarah pulled away, her face pale. "What the hell?" "Let's just keep moving," I muttered, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was growing in my chest. I told myself it was part of the act, a way to freak people out. But the woman's words echoed in my mind like a warning. As we approached the final room, the atmosphere shifted drastically. The temperature plummeted, and the air became thick, almost unbreathable. There was a stench, an overwhelming, sickly smell of decay that seeped into my nose and clung to the back of my throat. It wasn't the kind of fake odor used in haunted houses. This was something else, something that made my stomach churn violently. Sarah covered her nose, her eyes watering. The door to the last room creaked open, revealing a long hallway. But this hallway was different. It stretched impossibly far, as if the house had grown beyond its physical limits. At the end stood a clown, its oversized shoes squeaking as it shifted its weight from one foot to the other. He was holding a blood-stained mallet, grinning wide enough that his cheeks seemed to split. But there was something about him, something that went beyond the usual horror gimmicks. His eyes, they weren't human. They gleamed with something malevolent, something hungry. "Is this the last scare?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah, I think," I replied. though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The clown tilted its head, the motion jerky and unnatural. His grin widened, impossibly so, until his lips were stretched so far it seemed they would tear. He was taller than any of the other actors, towering over the doorframe, his long limbs hanging loosely like a marionette, waiting for strings to be pulled. His movements were wrong, too erratic, too deliberate, like he wasn't acting at all. "Let's just go," Sarah whispered, but her voice cracked. We stepped into the hallway, and before we could even think of turning back, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening thud. I whipped around, banging my fist against the wood, but it was sealed shut. There was no way out. Panic began to rise in my chest. The clown started walking toward us, his feet scraping against the floor, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. His grin never faltered. If anything, it grew wider, exposing blackened, rotting teeth. "Run!" Sarah screamed, yanking at my arm. We bolted down the hallway, but it felt like we were running in place. No matter how fast we moved, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before us, twisting and curving in ways that defied logic. The strobe lights flickered, disorienting us even more. My heart pounded in my chest, and Sarah's breathing grew ragged, her hand slipping from mine. I risked a glance back. The clown was still there, just a few feet behind us, moving at a maddeningly slow pace, but never losing ground. His eyes gleamed, reflecting the dim light, like a predator hunting its prey. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, he was gone. "Where the hell did he go?" I panted, skidding to a halt. But then the hallway began to fill with fog, thick, cold, and suffocating. It swirled around our legs, rising higher and higher until it reached our waists. In the fog, shadows twisted and writhed, shapes forming and dissolving in an instant. We could hear the sound of something heavy dragging behind us, a low, guttural scraping noise that made my blood run cold. When I turned around, the clown was there again, but he wasn't alone this time. Dozens of disfigured bodies were crawling out of the walls, their skeletal hands reaching for us. Their faces were contorted into expressions of pure agony, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. They moved unnaturally fast, their broken limbs twisting as they dragged themselves toward us. "Sarah, run!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the fog. Sarah darted ahead, her figure barely visible through the thick mist. I tried to follow, but something cold and clammy wrapped around my ankle, yanking me to the ground. I hit the floor hard, my head bouncing off the cold, slick surface. My vision blurred, but I could see the figures closing in, their skeletal hands reaching for me, their empty eyes staring hungrily. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. One of the figures, a grotesque, half-decayed corpse, crawled over me, its weight crushing my chest. Its breath was hot and sour, its teeth gnashing inches from my face. I could hear the sound of bones cracking, snapping, as the others piled on top of me, their cold fingers digging into my flesh. And then, through the fog, I saw him, the clown standing at the end of the hallway, grinning. His eyes glowed in the darkness as he raised the mallet high above his head, ready to strike. This wasn't a haunted house. This was a death trap, and we were never getting out.
There was something about this haunted house that made me uneasy from the start. It stood at the edge of town, shrouded in shadows, and even from the street, you could feel something watching. Everyone at the Halloween party had been raving about it all night, saying it was the most terrifying experience they'd ever had. People talked about it like it was an urban legend, the kind of place that gave you nightmares you could never shake. But I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way the house looked, too dilapidated, too abandoned, as if it had been forgotten by time, but remembered by something far darker. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, to stay far away, but my friends wouldn't let me. They dragged me along anyway, laughing and calling me paranoid. The house loomed larger as we approached, its windows black voids, the cracked and peeling walls seeming to whisper in the wind. The closer we got, the more that uneasy feeling grew in my chest, like a weight pressing down on me. I could feel something, someone watching from those dark windows. It wasn't just my imagination. "Come on," Jake, my best friend, said as he nudged me forward. "It's all for fun, just some actors and fake blood. You'll see." But I didn't laugh with them. My mouth felt dry, my hands clammy. I glanced back at the road, wondering if I could just leave, but my friends were already stepping through the front entrance, pulling me along with them. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they closed behind us, sealing us in. The first few rooms were typical haunted house fare. Plastic skeletons, fake blood splattered on the walls, chainsaw-wielding actors jumping out from dark corners. My friends laughed, pushing each other, trying to spook me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air inside was stale, thick, as if it hadn't been touched by fresh air in decades. There was a strange heaviness to the silence between the screams and laughter. It felt alive, like the house itself was breathing. As we ventured deeper into the house, the atmosphere shifted. The rooms became darker, the shadows longer, and the actors. They weren't like the ones at the entrance anymore. Their faces weren't covered in cheap rubber masks. They looked real, too real. Some had gaping wounds, their flesh hanging in strips, eyes glassy and vacant. I told myself it was good makeup, that it was just part of the act, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Then we reached the room that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The sign above the door read, "The Body Room." My friends laughed, joking about what horrors might be inside, but my stomach churned with a sense of impending doom. We stepped through the doorway, and immediately the temperature plummeted. It was freezing in here, colder than it should have been. My breath fogged up in the air, and the smell hit me like a punch in the gut, a rancid, sickly, sweet stench of rot. My friends wrinkled their noses, but they were still laughing, still playing along. I wasn't. The room was eerily quiet. There was no soundtrack of spooky noises, no actors jumping out from hidden corners. Instead, mutilated mannequins hung from the ceiling by thick chains, their limbs twisted and broken, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and horror. But they weren't what caught my attention. In the center of the room was a coffin, an old, decrepit thing with rotting wood and rusty hinges. A figure lay inside, perfectly still. "Go on," Jake dared me, his voice filled with mock bravado. "Check it out, see if it's real." I didn't want to. Every instinct told me to get out of there, to run and never look back. But the pressure of my friend's eyes on me was too much. I approached cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned in closer to the coffin, expecting an actor to jump out, maybe a loud noise or something to scare me. But nothing happened. The figure inside didn't move. It was pale, skin stretched tightly over its skeletal frame, eyes closed. The smell was overpowering now, the stench of decay burning my nostrils and turning my stomach. My hands shook as I got closer, and that's when I realized this wasn't an actor. This wasn't a mannequin. This was a corpse. I stumbled back, tripping over a mannequin's severed arm. My friends burst out laughing, thinking I'd been scared by some cheap scare prop. But I knew better. I had felt it, the icy grip of death lingering in the air. I opened my mouth to warn them, to tell them that we needed to get out. But before I could speak, the door behind us slammed shut with a deafening clang, like the finality of a prison cell locking us in. The lights flickered wildly, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before dim, eerie red lights flickered on. And then I heard it, the soft creak of plastic joints moving. My heart stopped. The mannequins. They were moving, slowly, unnaturally, their heads twisted in our direction, their cold, dead eyes locking onto us. One by one, they dropped to the floor with a sickening thud, crawling toward us on broken, mangled limbs. The sound of their plastic bodies scraping across the floor was deafening in the silence, like nails on a chalkboard. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if something unseen was pulling them toward us, puppeteering them. My friends screamed and scrambled to the door, pounding on it with all their might, but it wouldn't budge. I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on the figure in the coffin. My breath caught in my throat as its eyelids slowly opened, revealing hollow black pits where eyes should have been. Its mouth stretched into a wide, grotesque grin, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. "Join me," it rasped, the voice low and guttural, like the last breath of something long dead. Its hand moved, reaching out toward me with bony fingers, the skin hanging loosely from its wrist. My body went cold as ice as its fingers brushed against my arm. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My legs felt rooted to the spot, as if the very floor had come alive and was holding me in place. My friends' panicked voices seemed distant, muffled, like they were in another world altogether. The figure's fingers curled around my wrist, pulling me closer to the coffin, its grin widening impossibly. I struggled to breathe, the air thick with the scent of death and decay. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me as the thing in the coffin dragged me closer. Its breath was hot and rancid on my face, and I could see maggots writhing in the decaying flesh of its cheeks. Just as I felt the cold grip of death pulling me under, the door burst open with a loud crash. Hands grabbed me, yanking me out of the room and into the hallway. My vision cleared and I saw the haunted house staff standing over me laughing. "Congratulations," one of them said, grinning. "You survived the body room." But their laughter felt hollow. My friends were still shaking, pale, as they stumbled out behind me. They had seen it too, felt it. This wasn't part of the show. That thing in the coffin wasn't just some actor in makeup. As I glanced back at the now shut door to the body room, I saw something, a face grinning at me through the crack. The hollow-eyed figure was watching, waiting, and I knew it wouldn't stop at the haunted house. It had followed me.
The haunted house was infamous, a place spoken about in hushed tones, especially around Halloween. It wasn't just known for jump scares or actors in cheap masks. No. What set this place apart was its basement, its terrifying, bone-chilling basement. People said it was more than just a haunted attraction. There were rumors that whatever lurked down there wasn't part of the show, that people went in and came out, changed. Some didn't come out at all. Others claimed that something followed them home. No one knew exactly what happened in that basement. The only thing people agreed on was that very few made it all the way through without begging to be let out. There were stories of people fainting, screaming for their lives, or worse, leaving in silence with hollow, empty eyes. I wasn't planning on being one of those people. It was Halloween, and I was ready for a thrill. I'd done haunted houses before, and nothing ever fazed me. But as my friends and I approached the house, that cold feeling of dread settled in my chest. Something about the night felt wrong. The sky was clouded over, the wind sharp, as if even nature was trying to warn us. My friends, ever the thrill seekers, led the way, laughing and cracking jokes as we approached the entrance. They didn't notice how the shadows around the house seemed to move, how the windows, black as pitch, seemed to stare down at us like eyes filled with malice. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the darkened street, but there was nothing. Once we got inside, the atmosphere was thick, suffocating, like the air itself had weight. It was an old house, creaking and groaning as if it was alive. We moved quickly through the upper floors, nothing unusual, just the typical haunted house fare. Actors jumped out with blood-covered knives, chainsaws revved in the distance, and dismembered bodies hung from the ceiling. But it wasn't until we reached the basement stairs that things took a turn. The entrance to the basement was hidden behind an old wooden door, barely visible in the flickering light. A sign above it read, "Enter at your own risk." My friends exchanged nervous grins, but I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Still, I couldn't back out now. The stairs were narrow, damp, and slick with moisture. The walls were covered in something dark. At first, I thought it was rust, but as we descended, the smell hit me. It wasn't rust, it was blood, old, dried, and fresh. The metallic tang filled the air, thick and nauseating. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we were descending into hell itself. The lights were dim, barely flickering, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Every step we took echoed in the narrow staircase, but there was something else. Faint whispers, just out of earshot, growing louder as we descended. By the time we reached the bottom, the air was suffocating, thick with decay and rot. The basement was a labyrinth, a maze of narrow corridors and low ceilings. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, tightening with every turn we took. The floor beneath us squelched as we walked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting past or a figure lurking in the distance, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. As we wandered deeper, trying to find the way out, the horrors became more real. Disembodied voices whispered our names, faint and distant at first, but growing louder, more insistent. I could feel something watching us, something just out of sight, waiting. We turned a corner, and that's when we saw it, a door. It was different from the others, old and worn, with deep scratches marring its surface, like something had tried to claw its way out. The hinges were rusted, and the wood was warped, as if it had been there for centuries. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse racing in my ears. Everything in me screamed to turn back, but my body moved on autopilot. Without thinking, I pushed it open. The door creaked ominously as it swung wide, revealing a pitch-black room. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything beyond the doorway. And then we heard it, the sound of breathing. It wasn't ours. Something else was in that room, something hidden in the inky blackness, waiting. The door slammed shut behind us with a force that rattled the walls, and we were plunged into darkness. Panic set in immediately. My friends started screaming, their voices rising in fear as they clawed at the door, but it wouldn't open. I couldn't see a thing. I reached out, trying to find someone, anyone, but all I felt was the cold, clammy air. And then I felt it, something cold and bony wrapping around my neck, rough skeletal hands gripping me tightly, choking the air from my lungs. I thrashed, trying to break free, but the more I fought, the tighter the grip became. My heart hammered in my chest, my vision blurring as my airways constricted. I could hear the others gasping, choking, their voices desperate and terrified, but I couldn't help them. I was suffocating, my mind growing foggy. The hands were impossibly strong, their icy fingers digging into my skin. I could feel the life being squeezed out of me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My lungs burned, my head swam, and I thought this was it. I was going to die in this cursed place, strangled by unseen hands in a basement that should have never existed. Just when I thought I was going to black out, the lights flickered on, dim and sickly, but enough to see that the room was empty. The hands disappeared, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my throat raw and bruised. The room was eerily silent, save for the ragged breathing of my friends. They were on the ground too, pale and trembling, but alive. The door, the same one that had locked us in, was wide open now, as if nothing had happened. I could feel something in the air, a heavy presence lingering, watching us, but it was invisible. We didn't wait for another scare. We bolted, scrambling up the stairs, our legs heavy and weak. We didn't stop until we were outside, breathing in the cold night air, the house looming behind us like a shadow of death. My friends were laughing nervously, trying to convince themselves it was all just part of the show, but I knew better. I could still feel it. Those hands, they weren't part of the attraction. They were real, too real. For days afterward, I tried to shake the feeling, but the nightmares came. Every night, I'd wake up gasping for air, the sensation of those cold, skeletal fingers around my throat, squeezing tighter and tighter. Each night, it grew worse. I could hear the breathing in my room now, faint at first, then louder, closer. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the grip tightening. One of these nights, I know it's not going to let go.